What would you do if you made a bet to marry someone, thinking it was an easy win, only to have your life completely flipped upside down? That's exactly what happened to James, a millionaire who thought he could marry a woman he believed would be nothing more than a prize to claim. But what he didn't expect was how deeply his feelings would evolve. In this story, James soon learns that love, respect, and self-worth are not games to be won. Stick around to find out what happens when his bet takes an unexpected turn. Welcome back to the channel, everyone. If you're new here, please subscribe to our channel, and today we're diving into a jaw-dropping story of a millionaire who made a bet to marry a woman he believed would be easy to manipulate. But what he didn't expect was how his life would change after that fateful decision. Stay tuned to find out what happened next. James had always been the center of attention. Growing up in a modest family, he'd learned the hard way that nothing in life came easily. But that all changed when he stepped into the world of business. Armed with ambition and a sharp mind, James rose from the bottom to the very top. His company had become one of the most successful tech firms in the world, and his name was now synonymous with wealth and power. His life was a constant whirlwind of meetings, events, and business deals that kept him on the move. He was living the dream. Money, fame, luxury, all of it was at his fingertips. His penthouse apartment was a reflection of his success. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, with sparkling lights that stretched endlessly into the horizon. He had cars worth more than most people's entire savings, and his wardrobe was filled with the finest designer clothes. In every corner of his world, there was an aura of opulence. Yet, despite the impressive exterior, there was a strange emptiness that gnawed at him from the inside. James had always prided himself on his ability to get what he wanted, whether it was through hard work or manipulation. But in the quiet moments when the parties were over and the workday had ended, he often found himself wondering if there was more to life than this. It wasn't a question of success. He had that in spades. It was something deeper. He had achieved everything he thought would bring him happiness, yet he felt unfulfilled. James was starting to realize that there was a difference between achieving success and finding real meaning in life. The more he looked around at his lavish surroundings, the more he felt a growing void. He had everything that most people dreamed of, yet none of it brought him true contentment. One evening, James attended yet another high-end gala. The elite of the city gathered in one of the most exclusive venues, an elegant ballroom adorned with crystal chandeliers and velvet curtains. The soft clinking of champagne glasses and the low hum of conversations filled the air. People were mingling, laughing, and flaunting their latest successes, and James was, as usual, the star of the show. His entrance was met with nods of approval and admiration from the crowd. He was the picture of success, but as he surveyed the room, he couldn't shake the feeling of restlessness that had been building inside him for months. As the night went on, the conversation turned to relationships. James's friends, all of whom were equally wealthy and powerful, began discussing the notion of the perfect partner. The talk was centered around looks, wealth, and societal status, the superficial qualities that James had always believed were the true markers of success. The more they talked, the more James grew bored with the discussion. He'd been around this crowd enough to know that these people valued appearance and material wealth above all else. They admired only what was visible on the surface. And that's when the idea hit him. With a smirk on his face and a glint of mischief in his eyes, James made a bold suggestion. "What if I told you," he said, "that I could marry a woman who doesn't meet society's idea of perfect?" His friends looked at him in surprise. They were used to James being the center of attention, But this was different. It wasn't a business deal or a power move. It was a personal challenge. You think you can marry someone who's not, well, conventionally attractive? One of his friends asked, intrigued by the idea. James, with his usual bravado, shrugged. I'll marry someone who's not the ideal woman. No designer clothes, no perfect body, and no high-profile background. And I'll still win. I'll show you all that it's easy to win in this game. The challenge is simple. I'll get her to marry me, and I'll make it seem like she's the one who's lucky to have me. His friends laughed, thinking he was joking, but James was dead serious. To him, it wasn't just a bet. It was a game he was certain he could win. He was confident in his ability to charm and manipulate anyone, even if they didn't fit the mold of what society considered beautiful. It would be an easy win, he thought. After all, he had always been able to get whatever he wanted with his money, charm, and influence. A woman who didn't meet conventional standards of beauty? She'd be an easy target for his manipulative skills. The terms of the bet were simple. James would marry a woman who didn't meet society's ideal of beauty, and if he succeeded, he'd win a significant amount of money from his friends. They agreed, laughing at the audacity of the challenge, but also intrigued by the possibility of seeing James pull it off. But what James didn't realize was that he had underestimated the complexity of human emotions and underestimated the woman who would soon become the center of his life. And that's where Sarah came into the picture. Sarah was everything James thought he could easily manipulate. She wasn't interested in the superficial qualities that most people valued. She wasn't tall, thin, or flawless in appearance. Sarah didn't care about following trends or fitting into society's beauty standards. In a world where appearance often determined one's value, Sarah stood out because she wasn't interested in meeting anyone's expectations. She was unapologetically herself, and it was clear to anyone who met her that her self-worth didn't depend on anyone's opinion. James first saw her at the same party where he made the bet. She wasn't the type of woman he would normally pay attention to. She was sitting in a corner, talking to a group of friends, laughing and enjoying herself. Her figure wasn't slim or perfectly shaped. She wasn't wearing a flashy dress or heavy makeup. But what struck James about her was her confidence. Sarah carried herself with a quiet assurance that intrigued him. She wasn't seeking attention, but she commanded it through the way she carried herself, the way she spoke, and the way she interacted with others. Her laughter was genuine, and there was an authenticity to her that James hadn't seen in most women. Sarah wasn't trying to impress anyone, and that was something James wasn't used to. He was used to women vying for his attention, trying to impress him with their beauty or status. But Sarah didn't need to do any of that. She was simply herself, and that intrigued James more than anything else. At first, James didn't think much of her. To him, she was just another woman at the party. Someone who didn't fit the mold of what society would call perfect. But as he observed her, he began to realize that she was different. She didn't need validation from anyone. And for the first time in his life, James felt challenged. He wasn't sure why, but something about her drew him in. Perhaps it was the fact that she wasn't interested in playing his games, or maybe it was the way she carried herself with grace and dignity. Whatever it was, James couldn't deny that Sarah was unlike any woman he had ever met. The night was alive with the sound of laughter and clinking glasses. The extravagant ballroom of the Grand Hotel was filled with the elite of the city. Wealthy business people, socialites, and celebrities, all wrapped in designer attire. The lights from the crystal chandeliers reflected off the polished floors, casting a soft glow on the smiling faces and perfectly tailored suits. It was a scene of opulence and excess, and James was in his element. As the crowd mingled, exchanging compliments and engaging in the usual small talk of high society, James found himself at the center of a conversation with his closest friends. They were all successful in their own right, accustomed to wealth and privilege. But on this particular evening, the topic at hand was a little more personal: relationships. The conversation had started innocently enough, with one of his friends mentioning how difficult it was to find the one in a world where appearances often mattered more than compatibility. As expected, James was quick to join in. He leaned back in his chair, taking a sip from his champagne glass, a confident smirk forming on his lips. "Don't tell me you guys are still on about finding the perfect woman," James said with a chuckle, shaking his head. "That's the easiest thing in the world. The key to success isn't about the perfect partner. It's about knowing how to win at the game. If you're in the right circles, if you've got the money, the charm, and the status, you can have any woman you want." His friends laughed, some nodding in agreement, while others raised their eyebrows at his arrogance. But it wasn't the first time James had boasted about his ability to attract attention. He was the kind of man who never had to worry about being rejected. The women he wanted were always drawn to his wealth, power, and undeniable presence. He had the luxury of choosing from a pool of women who fit society's standards of beauty, women who knew their place in his world and played by the rules he set. But then, the conversation shifted. One of his friends, Dave, leaned forward, his eyes glinting with interest. "All right, James, let's see you prove it. Marry a woman who isn't perfect, someone who doesn't fit the mold. No money, no glamour. Can you do that? Show us you can win someone over who's not part of your usual world." The suggestion was playful at first, but as James listened to his friends laughing, something inside him stirred. He had always been the man who could get what he wanted, so why not prove that he could marry a woman who defied expectations? He loved a challenge. James, with his usual charm, grinned. "You think I can't? Watch me." And with that, the bet was set. The rules were simple. James would marry a woman who wasn't considered conventionally beautiful or rich by society's standards. If he could pull it off, convince her to marry him, and do so without falling in love or getting emotionally attached, he'd win a significant sum of money from his friends. But James was no fool. He wasn't just going to randomly pick a woman from the crowd. No, James had a plan. He'd been around long enough to understand the power dynamics of attraction. He knew how to use his wealth and status to influence people, and he was confident that the same tools would work on Sarah. She wasn't in his usual social circle, but he had a way of bending things to his advantage. He assumed that all he had to do was charm her, play the role of the interested, charismatic man, and she would fall in line just like every other woman. Sarah, however, had no interest in playing James's game. She wasn't like the women James typically associated with. She didn't chase after fame or try to impress anyone with her looks. She wasn't here to win anyone over, and she wasn't interested in playing by anyone's rules except her own. In fact, she had no idea about the bet at all. To Sarah, this party was just another social gathering, one where she could be herself without worrying about the judgment of others. Unlike the women James was used to, Sarah had a strong sense of self-worth. She had spent years learning to embrace her body and her appearance, rejecting society's shallow ideals. Sarah was not what most people would call beautiful by conventional standards. She was fuller-figured, with curves that didn't conform to the model-thin stereotype many people idealized. But what she lacked in conventional beauty, she made up for in confidence. She carried herself with pride and authenticity, and people were naturally drawn to her because of her energy and realness. At the party, Sarah had already made an impression, though she didn't know it yet. She wasn't trying to fit in. Instead, She was simply enjoying herself, talking to friends, laughing openly, and offering genuine conversation. In a room full of people obsessed with appearances and status, Sarah was a breath of fresh air. Her laughter was contagious, and she didn't need to seek validation from anyone. But there was something about James that intrigued her. Not in a romantic way, but in a more curious, cautious manner. He was used to getting attention from women, of course, but Sarah wasn't interested in that game. When James first approached her, she sensed his usual confident swagger and assumed he was just like every other wealthy man who thought his charm and success could win anyone over. To Sarah, it wasn't about the superficial connection James seemed to offer. It was about real value, respect, and mutual understanding. She wasn't interested in superficial charm. She wanted substance. Unlike the women James was used to, Sarah wasn't seeking attention. She didn't feel the need to prove herself to anyone. She wasn't here to play his game, and she wasn't impressed by his wealth or power. She had built a life for herself based on her own values and wasn't about to let anyone manipulate her into becoming part of their world. James approached Sarah with a smooth, practiced smile. He had done this 1,000 times before. His voice was warm and inviting as he started with a compliment. "I couldn't help but notice your energy from across the room," he said, leaning in slightly. "You have a rare kind of confidence, something you don't often see around here." Sarah raised an eyebrow, amused, but also slightly wary. She had dealt with men like James before, and she wasn't fooled by his polished charm. "Thank you, I guess," she said, her tone casual but firm. "I just don't believe in pretending to be someone I'm not. It's tiring." James chuckled, sensing her resistance. He was used to this. A little pushback only made the game more interesting. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a more intimate tone. "You know, I admire that. You're not like the others. Most people here are trying to impress everyone. But you seem different." Sarah smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile James was hoping for. "I am different," she replied, "and I'm not interested in impressing anyone." The words stung, but James quickly recovered. He wasn't used to being dismissed so easily, and yet something about Sarah's unapologetic attitude intrigued him. He could feel a spark of challenge, a fire he hadn't expected. The more he tried to charm her, the more she seemed to pull away. And yet, that only made her more fascinating to him. What James hadn't anticipated was how difficult it would be to manipulate someone like Sarah. She wasn't impressed by his wealth, his status, or his smooth lines. She wasn't looking for a rich husband or someone to fill an empty space in her life. She had already built her own life, one where she was in control. The more James tried to use his typical tactics to win her over, the more he realized that Sarah wasn't going to play along. Despite his initial belief that he could win this bet easily, James found himself challenged in a way he hadn't been before. Sarah wasn't just a target for his manipulation. She was a woman with her own desires, dreams, and values. The game wasn't as simple as he thought. As James's attempts to charm Sarah became more persistent, he began to realize that this wasn't just about the money anymore. Something inside him had shifted. He found himself genuinely interested in her. He wasn't just trying to win a bet. He was beginning to understand that there was something more at play here, something that went beyond the superficial dynamics of power, wealth, and control. The bet had started as a simple challenge, one that James was sure he could win. But as he spent more time around Sarah, he began to realize that he had underestimated her. She wasn't just any woman. She was confident, independent, and immune to the superficial charm he had always relied on. And as James learned, this wasn't a game he could easily win. James sat in his penthouse apartment late one evening, staring out over the sprawling city below. The bright lights of the metropolis reflected in his glass of whiskey, and he absent-mindedly swirled the liquid, lost in thought. The usual chatter of his friends, the laughter and clinking glasses from the parties he so often attended, seemed distant now. For the first time in a long while, he felt an unfamiliar heaviness settle in his chest. He thought back to how it had all started, the bet with his friends, the challenge to win Sarah over. It had seemed like a harmless game, something to add excitement to his otherwise predictable, successful life. He had never anticipated that it would turn into something so complicated. James had always prided himself on being in control, on being the one who pulled the strings. But now, he was no longer sure of anything. In the beginning, Sarah had been just another target in his eyes, someone he thought he could easily manipulate into marriage for the sake of his bet. But, as time passed, he had found himself looking at her differently. She wasn't a pawn to him anymore. She had become a person he admired. At first, he tried to push away these feelings. He told himself it was just the thrill of the chase, the fact that she wasn't like the other women he knew. But the truth was undeniable. He was beginning to care about her. The walls he had so carefully constructed around his heart, built over years of protecting himself from vulnerability, were starting to crack. He was starting to wonder if this bet was about far more than the money. For a man who had always seen life through a lens of transactions, this was something new. Feelings. Real, uncontrollable emotions. And it terrified him. James sighed, rubbing his temples. He wasn't supposed to feel this way. He wasn't supposed to care. But Sarah had done something he hadn't expected. She had chipped away at his ego and pride in ways no one had ever managed. The next few days were a blur. James found himself making excuses to spend more time with Sarah. They would meet at a local cafe, tucked away from the noise of the city, or stroll through the park on sunny afternoons. It wasn't the luxury and glamour of his usual lifestyle, but there was something undeniably real about the moments they shared. There were no pretenses with Sarah. She didn't care about his wealth, his fame, or the status he carried. She cared about the person he was inside, his thoughts, his passions, and even his flaws. James was surprised at how easy it was to talk to her. They would laugh about the silly things in life, the awkwardness of online dating, the bizarre things people do in their daily lives, or the random events that made them both shake their heads in disbelief. It wasn't always deep conversation, but it was real. He had spent years living a life where everything seemed like a performance, where people only showed their best selves and wore masks. But Sarah didn't need to pretend. She was just herself. And somehow, that made him feel more comfortable in his own skin. One evening, they found themselves sitting on a park bench, watching the sunset. Sarah had a way of seeing the beauty in everything, in even the simplest things. She pointed out the way the light reflected on the lake, or how the trees swayed gently in the breeze. Her ability to find peace in such small, everyday moments was contagious. "Isn't it beautiful?" she said, her voice soft but full of wonder. "I think people forget to notice these things sometimes." James nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. He was too distracted by the way Sarah looked at the world, how she was so completely immersed in the present, so fully alive. And for a moment, he wished he could be like that too. He had spent so many years chasing after things that didn't matter: money, power, and the validation of others. But now, for the first time, he was beginning to understand what really mattered. As they continued talking, Sarah shared her dreams with him, the things she wanted to accomplish in her life. the kind of person she strived to be. Her sincerity, her ambition, and her kind-hearted nature left a lasting impression on him. He realized that she wasn't just a good bet or a challenge anymore. She was someone whose character he respected deeply. There were moments of quiet between them, moments where neither of them spoke but simply enjoyed the presence of the other. It was in these moments that James began to feel something shift within him. He was beginning to see Sarah for who she truly was, not as the woman he thought he could manipulate, but as someone with her own worth, her own soul. Over time, James started to see Sarah in a completely different light. The woman he thought he could use in a bet became someone he couldn't stop thinking about. Her intelligence, kindness, and strength began to affect him in ways he hadn't expected. As the days went by, the lines between the bet and reality blurred, and James found himself falling in love with her. One afternoon, James sat in his office, absent-mindedly signing papers and making calls. His thoughts kept drifting back to Sarah. The image of her laughing, her eyes sparkling with excitement as she shared a story, stayed with him. He couldn't concentrate on work. His mind was elsewhere, pulled into thoughts of her. It hit him all at once. The realization came like a wave crashing over him, leaving him breathless. He was in love with Sarah. The person he had thought was just part of a game, part of a bet, had become the center of his world. And now, everything was different. He was no longer the confident, cocky man he used to be. His feelings for her had changed the very way he viewed his life. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling as guilt began to seep in. How could he have been so foolish? How could he have treated her like a game, like an object to be won? He had underestimated her in every possible way. She wasn't just a bet to win. She was everything he had been missing in his life. Genuine, real, and unapologetically herself. James felt his chest tighten. The weight of the bet, the money, and the challenge now seemed insignificant. All of it felt meaningless compared to what he felt for Sarah. The thing was, he had never expected to fall for someone like her. She wasn't what he had initially thought he wanted. But now, he realized that she was everything he needed, and he didn't know what to do with those feelings. As the days passed, James found himself growing more and more drawn to Sarah. He couldn't deny it anymore. The woman he had once viewed as a conquest had become someone he cared for deeply. He realized that the love he felt wasn't just about infatuation. It was real. It was genuine. But the truth was, he didn't know if she felt the same. Could she ever love him back? After all, he had treated her as a pawn in a bet, a mere challenge to win. Could he ever erase the hurt and disappointment she must have felt when she found out the truth? James didn't have the answers, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't live with the lie anymore. He had to come clean. He had to tell Sarah everything, the bet, his intentions, and how everything had changed for him. But even as he resolved to confess, doubt crept in. What if she didn't forgive him? What if she rejected him for the way he had treated her? The fear of losing her consumed him. But no matter how hard he tried to push these feelings away, he knew he couldn't ignore them anymore. As James spent more time with Sarah, he began to realize that the bet wasn't the only thing that had changed. He had changed too. Sarah had done what no one else had ever done before. She had opened his eyes to a world of real emotions, real love, and real vulnerability. And now, James had to face the consequences of his actions. The man who thought he could control everything was now at the mercy of his own heart. All right, let me ask you this. What do you think? Did James truly fall for Sarah? Or do you think it was all just a way for him to save face and salvage his ego? After everything he put her through, do you think there's room for genuine love? Was he simply trying to cover up the mess he made of the bet? Or maybe, just maybe, something deeper? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I'm really curious to hear what you think. And hey, don't forget to hit that like button if you're enjoying the video so far. And of course, subscribe if you want to hear more intriguing stories like this one. We've got so many more stories to unpack together, and trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. While we've been talking about James's journey, let's think about Sarah for a moment. Can you blame her for being skeptical? I mean, imagine someone coming up to you, treating you like a bet, a challenge, something to be conquered. That takes a toll on a person. She didn't know James was struggling with his own feelings. How could she? She only knew the man who came into her life with manipulation on his mind, trying to play the game of life like it was some kind of competition. So, do you think Sarah should have given James a chance? Was it too late for him to redeem himself? After everything he put her through, could love really come out of that situation? I'm sure some of you are thinking, he messed up too much, he's not worth the emotional risk. And others might say, well, people can change. Maybe Sarah saw the man he was becoming, not just the one he was at the beginning. What's your take? Let me know in the comments. And you know what else? This whole situation with James and Sarah raises a pretty important question. How many of us have ever been in a situation where we didn't see the other person clearly, only to realize later that they weren't what we thought they were? Have you ever misjudged someone based on surface-level impressions? Let's be real. We all have. It's easy to make assumptions about others based on their appearance, status, or past actions. But, like in James's case, things aren't always as they seem. Sarah was never going to let herself be defined by someone else's idea of her worth. That's why she didn't fall for James's charm, at least not at first. She wasn't looking for validation from a man who thought he could buy his way into her life. She was looking for someone who could meet her on her level, someone who didn't need to play games to get her attention. So, let's pause for a second. Think about the last time someone tried to impress you by showing off their money or status. Were you impressed? Or did it leave you wondering, is that all you have to offer? If you're like Sarah, you probably want something deeper, something more meaningful, something real. But let's not forget, there's a whole other side to this. What if James didn't even know what he was doing wrong until it was too late? What if he never realized the weight of his actions until he was already falling in love with Sarah? He got so caught up in his ego, in the thrill of winning, that he forgot what it meant to truly care for someone. And now, his whole world has shifted. So what do you think? Is it too late for him to turn things around? I think that's the real beauty of this story. It's not just about the bet anymore, is it? It's about the complexity of human relationships, the messiness of emotions, the journey of realizing you're not who you thought you were, and the risk of letting someone see the real you. It's about vulnerability. And vulnerability is scary, right? We've all been there. And you know what? Vulnerability doesn't just come from romantic relationships. It can happen with friends, with family, even with colleagues. Being real with people, letting them see the messy parts of your life, and still accepting each other. That's the kind of connection Sarah and James had to build from scratch. But I'm asking you, is it even possible for them to make it work after all the lies? Is that even fair to ask of someone after they've been hurt? All right, drop your thoughts below. I want to hear from you. What would you do if you were in Sarah's shoes? Could you forgive someone who treated you like a bet? Or would it be game over from the start? Drop a comment right now, and let's get into this discussion. And maybe that's what makes this story so interesting. People's capacity to change. Can James change? Can he redeem himself? Can he prove that his feelings for Sarah are real? Or is he just going to walk away and leave her behind? I mean, let's face it, he started this as a game.